April 26, 1945, dawn over the Oder River was not silent. The wind carried the crackle of distant machine gun fire, the thunder of tank engines, and the occasional whine of Stuka sirens long after the planes themselves were gone. But there were no Stukas flying this morning. There hadn't been for weeks. What echoed through the trees was just a broken loudspeaker in some half-collapsed headquarters, endlessly replaying Hitler's propaganda tapes to no one in particular. On the eastern bank of the river, near the shattered hamlet of Riesen, a German corporal named Erich Schuler clutched a Karabiner 98K rifle with frostbitten fingers. The bolt was still slick with factory grease. It had never been fired. His unit was the 27th Volkssturm Regiment, 3rd Battalion. Strength, 162 men. Ammunition, 71 usable rifles, 2 machine guns, no mortars, no radios, and a handful of anti-tank grenades that arrived without detonators. Of the 162, at least 40 were under the age of 16, and another 25 were over 60. Farmers, office clerks, a baker, a retired tailor. Their rations had run out 3 days ago. Their boots were patched with wire and newspaper. Schuler heard the dull rumble first. At first he thought it was thunder. Then came the vibrations, rising through the soles of his boots, pulsing in his calves. It wasn't thunder. He turned, clutching the rifle tighter, heart drumming against his ribs. The trembling earth groaned louder. The sky remained gray and featureless, no enemy in sight. But the noise kept growing. Louder, closer. Then he saw it through the morning mist. Not one, dozens. Soviet T-34s, columns of them, trundling down the distant road like iron beasts waking from hibernation. Behind them, rows of men in padded jackets, helmets tilted forward, PPSH submachine guns slung over shoulders like garden tools. Hundreds of them. Then thousands. The trees on the far hill seemed to ripple from the sheer weight of movement behind them. The Volkssturm men began to stir. Some looked to the left, toward Berlin. Others looked to the right, toward nowhere. No one moved forward. A ragged boy no older than 14 whispered, "They said we would have artillery. Where is it?" No one answered. A young officer, Lieutenant Weiss, barely 20 and missing 3 fingers, stood atop a low hill, waving a Luger in one hand and a tattered map in the other. His voice cracked as he shouted, "Hold the line! Reinforcements are coming." But no reinforcements were coming. They had never been. By late April 1945, over 300,000 German soldiers and conscripts had been ordered into last-ditch battle groups from the Oder to the Alps. Many were Volkssturm, Hitler's People's Army, conscripted at gunpoint from villages and cities now reduced to rubble. They were issued weapons when available, helmets when possible, training never. Some were Wehrmacht remnants cobbled together with SS units that refused to surrender. Others were Luftwaffe ground crews handed Panzerfausts, or Kriegsmarine sailors sent into the woods to ambush tanks. At Hitler's command, these forces were to resist to the last bullet, even as the Reich collapsed in flames behind them. The room in the Führerbunker had gone quiet 2 days earlier. General Bergdorf had stood stiffly at attention as Hitler, eyes glassy and hands trembling, slammed his fist on the map table. "They will fight," Hitler growled, voice brittle with rage and delusion. "Every man, every child. Berlin is the heart of the Reich. They will not pass." Behind him, Goebbels nodded feverishly. Cadel saluted. No one dared say what they all knew. The heart had already stopped beating. Yet from this room of rotting carpets and flickering lamps, Hitler issued orders for Operation Clausewitz, total defense of Berlin. Civilian police units were drafted into battle groups. Railway workers were armed with old Czech rifles. Teenagers were given Panzerfausts and posted at street corners. Across the collapsing map of Nazi Germany, more than 300,000 men were summoned to a war that no longer existed, except in one man's mind. Back at Riesen, Schuler squinted at the tree line. The Soviets had stopped, tanks idling, infantry crouched. The horizon was silent again except for something soft, rhythmic. He tilted his head. It sounded like music. He crept forward a few feet, careful not to step on loose debris. Yes, music. A crackling tune from across the river. A Soviet loudspeaker. The Red Army was playing a slow, haunting Russian lullaby, piping it across the trees on purpose. Psychological warfare. Let the children hear something soft before the end. The older men stared blankly. One of them, a former schoolteacher, began to weep. From behind them came a sharp command. Lieutenant Weiss again, voice straining. "Fix bayonets." No one moved. A man named Otto, 56, who'd once run a cafe in Potsdam, shouted back, "Against what, sir?" "Steel monsters and machine guns." "With what kitchen knives?" Weiss fired his Luger into the air. "You are Germans," he screamed. "You will obey." But the wind answered louder than any man. And then, as if the lullaby had ended its last verse, the horizon erupted, artillery whistles, tank barrels flashing, trees cracking like bones. Soviet fire poured across the river. Schuler dove behind a half-collapsed trench. Dirt sprayed. A boy screamed. The two machine guns opened up, rattling helplessly against an armored onslaught they had no hope of slowing. By noon, the battalion had ceased to exist. The fields were torn mud, men scattered or surrendered. Soviet medics stepped around shattered fences, dragging the wounded back across the lines. A tank crushed a wooden cart that had been filled with bread and helmets. Schuler survived by burying himself under the body of a dead ox and pretending to be lifeless. He would lie there for hours, breathing in the stink of blood and manure, wondering not if Germany had lost, but why they had ever been told they hadn't. And far away, inside the Führerbunker, Hitler read a forged report claiming his men were holding the Oder line. The stench of rot and gasoline still lingered on Schuler's uniform as he marched, hands raised, alongside the remnants of his battalion, what little was left of it. They had been captured at dusk and led past the burning skeleton of a barn that had once served as their field headquarters. The Soviets didn't taunt them. They didn't need to. Their silence said enough. You fought for nothing. You died for less. They were shoved into a makeshift holding pen beneath the broken rafters of a church that had no roof. And as night fell and the stars blinked above the open sky, one of the boys, barely 15, nose still bleeding, asked aloud, "Why did we even come here? Who sent us?" The older men didn't answer. But Schuler thought of the orders that had arrived only 4 days earlier, a folded sheet of paper, stamped with the Reichsadler seal, delivered by a trembling postal courier. It had said only this: "The Fatherland calls every able-bodied man. Report to the collection center at Nordbahnhof. Failure to appear is treason." There had been no weapons ready at the station. No food. Just a list of names, a pile of uniforms in mismatched sizes, and an officer who shouted, "You're no longer civilians. You are soldiers of Germany." But the truth was uglier. These men were never meant to fight. They were meant to die visibly, to show the world that Germany still bled, even if it bled out uselessly. Weeks earlier, in a villa near the Bavarian Alps, Heinrich Himmler had reviewed a report drafted by Martin Bormann. It outlined Hitler's latest decree: mass mobilization, not for strategic defense, but to create walls of flesh and willpower that would stall the enemy. It wasn't about victory anymore. It was about illusion, about forcing the world to believe Germany had fight left in it. Bormann had smiled as he slid the document across the polished table. "They'll die thinking they're defending Berlin," he said. Himmler had nodded. "And the world will believe we still have teeth." Back in Berlin, those teeth were cracking. The once imposing concrete avenues were filled not with soldiers, but with bicycles, wheelbarrows, and mothers searching for missing sons. In the Tiergarten, anti-aircraft crews had given up targeting planes. There were too many. Instead, they watched in stunned silence as American B-17s flew overhead in arrowhead formations, unchallenged, their silver bellies glinting even through smoke. Elsewhere in the capital, Children tore pages from Mein Kampf to use as toilet paper in bombed-out shelters. And still the orders came. In Dusseldorf, an 81-year-old man named Horst Blum, once a carpenter, was handed a rusted Italian rifle and told to guard a crossroads with a squad of schoolboys. He couldn't cock the bolt with his arthritis, so one of the boys loaded the rifle for him, then tied it around his shoulder with twine. In Dresden, a one-armed Luftwaffe ground technician was strapped with explosives and sent toward a bridge in the hopes he could destroy it before the Allies crossed. He didn't. In the Harz Mountains, a unit of wounded SS officers, missing limbs and carrying crutches, staged a mock defensive drill while American units rolled toward them in Sherman tanks. Their commander shot himself when they surrendered. But in southern Germany, in a village that had once hosted Hitler himself for a celebratory beer garden rally in 1934, the last great theater of delusion was taking shape. It was called Army Group South, and it was supposed to be a final bulwark, a fighting force of over 100,000 comprised of Wehrmacht remnants, Volkssturm, Hitler Youth, and what remained of the Waffen-SS. But in reality, it was chaos. Divisions were marked on maps that no longer matched the land. Radios picked up more static than orders, and the officers themselves had no illusions. One colonel, Erhard von Cross, walked out of a staff meeting in Salzburg and declared, "They want ghosts to hold the line. Well, let ghosts march then." He vanished that night with 2 horses, a rucksack of silver, and his mistress. But not all men fled. In the narrow valleys outside Linz, a makeshift German battalion dug trenches with shovels meant for gardening. Their commander, Captain Dietrich Hauser, wore a blood-stained greatcoat from Stalingrad. It still bore the frost-burned bullet holes from when he had last worn it 2 years ago, before being pulled from a frozen pit by a medic who said, "You're lucky the Russians aimed too low." Now he stood again, that same coat on his shoulders, his boots split at the soles, addressing 300 men, some veterans, most not. He pointed toward the southern ridge and said, "That's where the Americans are, but this isn't about them. It's about us." Someone asked, "What are we protecting?" Hauser paused, and finally replied, "The idea that we mattered." They held that ridge for 7 hours. The Americans came with tanks and air support. The Germans had 4 working rifles per platoon, a few Panzerfausts, and a single MG-42 with 30 rounds. They were overrun by mid-afternoon. Some ran. Some surrendered. A handful tried to fight with bayonets and fists. The last man standing was a boy named France, 17 years old, who had never fired a rifle before that morning. He emptied a full magazine into the dirt, screamed, and charged a Sherman tank. The gunner didn't fire. He simply stepped out of the hatch and tackled him. That evening the Americans served the prisoners coffee and canned ham. One German soldier broke down sobbing, not from pain, from shame. In the chaos that followed, across fields and forests from Brandenburg to Bavaria, the Wehrmacht collapsed like rotting timber. Orders still came, but there were no longer lines to carry them. Trains ran empty, loaded with blank forms and propaganda posters that fluttered uselessly in the spring wind. And through it all, Hitler remained in his bunker, demanding loyalty from the dead. On April 28, 2 days before his suicide, he issued a final command to General Wenck: break through the Soviet lines and relieve Berlin. Wenck's reply never came. He had already begun negotiating surrender to the Americans. But Hitler refused to believe it. To him, the 300,000 men still existed, marching, fighting, winning. He saw them in his head, in perfect formation, in crisp uniforms, saluting beneath banners that hadn't flown in months. He imagined their rifles polished, their boots firm, their voices chanting in unison. He did not see the truth. That 300,000 men had become 300,000 ghosts, scattered across a land that no longer wanted them, fighting for a regime that had already burned. The ones who lived would carry that silence with them for the rest of their lives, a silence that no anthem could drown, no victory could redeem. And the world, looking back, would ask, were they soldiers, or were they just bodies pushed toward gunfire so a madman could pretend the end hadn't come? The war was over, but no one had told the forests. They still whispered like they did before artillery, before tank treads had torn their roots, before the last spring of Hitler's Reich had filled them with the groans of dying boys and the silence of commanders who no longer believed their own orders. In a dense stretch of pine forest outside Regensburg, a group of 24 men wandered for days without direction. They were remnants, scattered from broken Volksgrenadier divisions, stragglers from a supply column that had been obliterated by rocket fire, and a pair of Luftwaffe technicians who had never held rifles until 2 days ago. Their commander, if he could still be called that, was a Feldwebel named Lucas Harth, 42, former mechanic, knee shattered by shrapnel at Narva in 44. He walked with a cane now, fashioned from the buttstock of a snapped Kar 98K. The men still called him Herr Feldwebel, but mostly out of habit, not hierarchy. There were no ranks anymore, just hunger and directionlessness. On the 4th night they found a barn. Inside were 2 sacks of grain, a crate of old beer bottles, and a boy no older than 12 hiding under a canvas tarp with a bayonet clutched to his chest. His eyes were wide, feral, and his teeth chattered. Harth held up his hands. "We're not here to hurt you." The boy didn't blink. "Where are your parents?" someone asked. The boy looked at them with disbelief, as if the word parents had no meaning anymore. "We're surrendering," Harth said, louder this time to no one in particular. "We're done." But there was nowhere to surrender to. The Americans were advancing from the west, the Soviets from the east, and in between was a shrinking patch of forest and farmland where men like Harth were ghosts, alive but already forgotten, marching for a cause that had burned itself out but refused to admit it. Elsewhere, Hitler's orders continued to ripple outward like a disease that hadn't realized its host was already dead. In Munich, a last-minute Volkssturm regiment was ordered to dig anti-tank trenches using shovels confiscated from school janitors. When one boy, 13 years old, still in his math class clothes, asked where the tanks would be coming from, the officer slapped him and shouted, "From everywhere." In a small town north of Innsbruck, a local official declared a final mobilization and posted notices on walls. All males between ages 13 and 65 must report for duty immediately. Long live the Führer. Only 3 men showed up. One was blind in one eye, another brought a wooden pitchfork, the third had a prosthetic leg and a dog. They were sent to guard a munitions dump that had been empty for weeks. In the bunker beneath Berlin, Hitler raged on. His world was a crumbling map lit by candles and lies. He issued commands to units that no longer existed. Divisions that had been obliterated months before were redeployed by his hand. He demanded counteroffensives from ghost armies and scolded his generals for cowardice when they failed to materialize. Joseph Goebbels stood at his side, nodding, lips thin and pressed, offering support with words that meant nothing. He too had begun to understand that the end was not coming, it had already arrived, but he played his role to the final breath. One night, in a half-destroyed barracks near Leipzig, an SS officer named Waldemar Kruger read aloud a new dispatch from Berlin. "All remaining forces are to regroup in the Alpine Redoubt. Hold firm. Reinforcements en route. Trust in the Führer." The men stared at him. One laughed just once, a short, bitter sound. "Reinforcements," he said. "From where, hell?" No one replied. Kruger folded the paper and placed it inside his coat. That night, he walked into the woods with his pistol and didn't return. In the north, along the Elbe River, the 11th Panzer Division, once a formidable armored force with over 150 tanks, now operated with only 3 usable vehicles. One had no turret. Another was used as an ambulance. The third had been painted with tree branches in a last-ditch attempt at camouflage. Their orders were to delay the American advance at all costs. But when the first American column rolled into sight, the German tank crews stepped out and waved white rags. They were offered cigarettes, coffee, and instructions to form a line. An American private, 20 years old from Ohio, whispered to his buddy, "These guys look more scared than we are." Back in Berlin, the city was no longer a city. It was a carcass. Buildings stood like broken teeth. The air was thick with smoke and plaster dust. Water lines had ruptured weeks ago. People drank from puddles in crater holes. Women boiled wallpaper for the glue. Men fought over boots on dead bodies. The Volkssturm patrols had dwindled. Most had deserted or died. The few who remained stumbled through the streets like drunk phantoms, rifles slung over their backs like crucifixes. And yet, inside the Reich Chancellery's underground warren, Hitler summoned a map and pointed. "Here," he said, "if Steiner attacks from the north and Wenck from the south, we can split the Soviets in 2. No one said anything. General Krebs stared at the floor. Goebbels nodded solemnly. Bormann made a note he would never read again. There was no Steiner army. There was no Wenck rescue. There were only ruins. At that very hour, Soviet artillery had begun targeting the Tiergarten and Brandenburg Gate. Shells fell like iron fists. Trees exploded. Statues of dead emperors lost their heads. A Soviet T rolled over a Nazi flag that had once flown above the Reichstag. It crushed it into the mud without notice. Inside a school basement converted into a hospital, Dr. Clara Voss treated her 114th patient of the week. No anesthetics, no morphine. She used vodka for sterilization and bits of metal trays as makeshift splints. A boy moaned beside her, 16, shrapnel in his thigh. His hand gripped a tattered propaganda leaflet that said, "Victory is near." He kept repeating it, "Victory is near, victory is near." Dr. Voss didn't correct him. Outside, another artillery barrage began. "You did your duty," he said quietly. "That's more than most." But the boys only stared at the floor. In Flensburg, Dönitz made a final radio broadcast on May 2nd. "The Führer has fallen, but the German people still live. The struggle must continue wherever possible. German soldiers must remain in place, protect civilians, and resist Bolshevik terror until political clarity is achieved." Political clarity. The words were as empty as the rooms they echoed through. Berlin was ash, Dresden was cinder, Cologne was shattered glass and river mud. No political clarity would come, only occupation. In a hospital tent near Nuremberg, a British officer asked a captured German lieutenant what he thought of Dönitz's orders. The lieutenant, 28, covered in grime and blood, simply replied, "I think we should have burned our radios months ago." Even as pockets of resistance flickered like dying embers, the scale of the sacrifice revealed itself in numbers too heavy to grasp. Of the estimated 300,000 men Hitler ordered into final defense in April 1945, less than a third remained alive by mid-May. Tens of thousands had died in forests, fields, craters, alleys, and cellars. Many were never identified. Many weren't even buried. The Wehrmacht had stopped existing as an effective army weeks earlier. The Volkssturm had never really been won. And yet the orders had kept coming. Even as the Soviets stormed the Reichstag, placing their red banner atop the smoking ruins. Even as General Jodl signed the surrender at Reims on May 7. Even as Eisenhower told his staff, "It's over, boys. This damn thing is finally over." But for the men still alive, those who had fought in the ghost battalions of Hitler's final war, It wasn't over. Not really. Because what came next was worse. The surrender brought peace only on maps. In the Soviet zones, German soldiers were marched east in columns like cattle. Many would never be seen again. In American and British camps, the prisoners were given bread, interrogated, and slowly processed. But even there, shame hung like fog. Men flinched at the sight of red crosses. Some refused to speak. Others spoke too much. At a holding camp near Kassel, a young American corporal recorded in his diary, "They keep asking for cigarettes. Not food, not water, just cigarettes, as if smoke can cover what they've done." In a repurposed barn outside Munich, a Wehrmacht major, once a decorated officer, sat in silence while a U.S. captain asked him how many men he had commanded in April. The major stared at his hands, his voice cracked. "None, I thought I had men, but they were boys and old men and ghosts." "Why didn't you refuse the order?" He looked up, blinking slowly. "Refuse, we were Germans." In the British sector, a captured SS officer wrote a letter to his wife that would never be delivered. In it, he said, "I see now that we were not fighting a war. We were props in a funeral play. They used us to pretend it wasn't already over." In the end, Hitler's last act wasn't a battle. It wasn't a speech. It was the quiet, grinding murder of his own people's hope, of their dignity, of their future. He ordered 300,000 men to fight a war already lost, not to win, but to delay the realization that it had already ended. Not to save the Reich, but to burn it slower. And in that final act of cruelty, he ensured that even surrender would feel like defeat. The war was over, but for the 300,000 men sent to die in Hitler's final hallucination, peace did not mean freedom. It meant reckoning. It meant questions that wouldn't be answered. It meant faces they couldn't look at in the mirror. And for most, it meant silence. By the end of May 1945, across what had once been the Third Reich, the ground was still soft with shell craters. The air still reeked of burnt timber, engine oil, and unburied death. American GIs moved cautiously through the rubble of what had been enemy strongholds and found nothing but empty bunkers, broken weapons, and sometimes a pair of boots with no feet inside. Outside Torgau, U.S. troops stumbled upon a group of 11 German Volkssturm fighters hiding in a hayloft. Their average age was 17. The youngest was 13. They had no weapons, only rusted bayonets and belt buckles. When the GIs shouted for them to come down, they did so weeping. "We weren't soldiers," the oldest said through sobs. "We were just told." That was the refrain, from Hamburg to the Alps, from the Oder to the Rhine. We were just told. Told by letters stamped with dying eagles. Told by men who'd long since fled. Told by voices on the radio that promised victory from bunkers where the walls sweated and the ceilings cracked with every Soviet shell. The final horror was this. These men had not fought for land, not even for country. They had fought for denial, for a lie sustained by sheer terror and nothing more. In Stuttgart, British officers walked among rows of surrendered Volkssturm troops, documenting units that had never officially existed. Each man's name was recorded, but their commanding officers, missing, executed, fled, or buried under the buildings they'd ordered defended. In a small farmhouse being used as a processing station, a British intelligence officer sat across from a German who had commanded a battalion of 90 men in the final defense of Nuremberg. "Why didn't you surrender?" the Brit asked. The German, gaunt and hollow-eyed, looked confused. "We weren't told we could." That was the Reich's final order: never admit the end. Even after it ended. In Soviet-occupied zones, German prisoners were herded into open fields behind barbed wire and left for weeks without shelter. Food came irregularly. Beatings were routine. The Soviets remembered Stalingrad. They remembered Kursk. They did not forgive. Entire regiments disappeared into the east, marched into the Russian interior to fell trees, dig canals, or simply vanish in the snow. A German sergeant named Weber, who had been captured near Kustrin with a group of teenagers, managed to escape a POW column months later. He was found by Red Cross workers outside Warsaw, crawling through a ditch half-mad, speaking only in numbers. They later realized he was repeating the serial numbers of every boy in his unit, none of whom had survived. In the West, the Allies tried to process the tide of prisoners with more order. Temporary camps ballooned into cities of canvas and ration crates. Men were stripped, deloused, given numbers. For many, it was the first warm meal they'd had in weeks. Some wept at the taste of coffee. Others sat motionless, eyes vacant, waiting for orders that would never come. One American chaplain who visited a large camp outside Remagen described the men inside. It was like visiting the aftermath of a suicide pact. They weren't POWs. They were survivors of a reality collapse. No uniforms, no flags, just human beings utterly lost. In France, a French officer toured a prisoner site filled with men from the final defense of Metz. Many had fought until the last hour, firing obsolete rifles from wine cellars, waiting for reinforcements that never came. The officer stared at them behind the wire. "Why did you keep fighting?" he asked one of the older prisoners. The man shrugged. "We didn't know what else to do." But some had known, some had resisted the lie. Stories began to surface of entire battalions surrendering before orders came. One Volkssturm unit near Heidelberg marched directly into Allied lines with their hands up and rifles slung upside down. They carried a white bedsheet nailed to a broomstick. When asked why they had surrendered without fighting, the unit leader, a school principal named Lothar, said, "I taught these boys to read. I was not going to teach them to die." Other stories weren't so clean. In Munich, 3 senior Wehrmacht officers were found hanged in a beer hall. A note was pinned to one of their uniforms. "We followed orders. Now let them follow us." The post-war tribunals would focus on the crimes of those who commanded: Göring, Himmler, Keitel, Jodl, and the rest. But the question that lingered far longer wasn't about war crimes. It was about obedience. Why had so many followed orders to the end? Even when the cities were ash. Even when the commanders had vanished. Even when the war was already lost. In classrooms in post-war Germany, new teachers, many former soldiers themselves, were forced to explain what had happened. One 12-year-old in a town near Dresden raised his hand and asked, "Why did our fathers keep fighting?" The teacher, who had once worn the gray and red of an artillery unit, looked at the boy and said, "Because we were told the alternative was worse." He paused. It was. For the surviving 300,000, integration back into life, if it could be called life, was slow and painful. Many were denied jobs. Some changed their names. Others returned to homes where their families refused to look them in the eye. One man, a former company commander who had fought in the final defense of Königsberg, returned to find his house destroyed and his wife remarried. She left a note for him that read, "You fought too long for something that never loved you back." Another man, captured in the Alps after leading a resistance group that never fired a shot, opened a bakery in Stuttgart. He baked every day in silence for 19 years. On the 20th year, he put up a sign. "We are not soldiers anymore, only men who are still learning how to breathe." In the end, Hitler's last command was not about military defense. It was about delusion, about dragging 300,000 lives down with him into the grave he had dug for his empire. He knew the war was lost, but he could not lose alone. And so he gave an order, not for victory, not even for resistance, but for theater, a spectacle of collapse, a death march dressed as defiance. The 300,000 were not meant to win. They were meant to burn. They were the stage props of a final act no one wanted to see, except the man who had written it. And now, decades later, no monuments stand for them. No parades. No flags. Only silence in the places where they once stood. In the forest where boots still rot under fallen leaves. In the cellars where rifles were stacked and never fired. In the photographs where their faces blur at the edges like fading ghosts. Because history did not forget them. It simply could not decide what they were. Soldiers, victims, monsters, or merely men, ordered to fight a war already lost.